My entire family chose my lying ex over me during our divorce and cut me off completely, but when news broke about what my son had achieved, every single one of them suddenly remembered my number, and I remembered exactly who they were when I needed them. The divorce papers were served on a Tuesday, and by Friday my sister had taken my ex-husband's side publicly enough that mutual friends were texting me screenshots. Not privately. Not in the specific careful way of someone who has heard one side and is reserving judgment. Publicly. A comment on a post. A photograph liked. The specific digital choreography of someone who has made a decision about which side of a line they are standing on and wants the decision to be visible. My sister Claudette was 44 years old and had known me my entire life and had been in my wedding and had held my son Tobias when he was 4 hours old in the hospital room while I was still being monitored, and she had looked at him the way people look at things they already love, and now she was liking photographs on the internet that communicated, to everyone who followed her, that the version of events being told about the end of my marriage was not the version I would have told. My name is Renata. 41 years old at the time of the divorce. Tobias was 16. My ex-husband was a man named Gregory who had been charming and specific in his cruelties across 14 years of marriage, in the way of people who are skilled enough at the charming to make the cruelties look like your problem rather than theirs. I had documented. I had been to a therapist. I had a lawyer named Harriet who had seen the documentation and had said clearly this is sufficient, and I had believed her and I had filed. Gregory had been faster at the family. I did not understand at first how thoroughly he had worked the network. He had called my mother before my lawyer called his. He had visited my uncle Raymond, my mother's brother, the one whose opinion carried weight in the family the way certain opinions carry weight, not because of anything formal but because of something accumulated across decades of being the person whose judgment was deferred to at the dinner table. He had told his version of the events of our marriage to people who loved me and who had known me for 41 years, and the version he told had been received. My mother called me 3 days after the papers were served. She said she had been talking to Gregory and that she was very concerned about what he had told her, and that she thought before anything went further to Tobias, and I should come and sit down with the family and really discuss whether this was the right path forward. I sat in my kitchen with the phone against my ear. Gregory had visited her. Before I had called her. Before I had said a single word to her about the filing. He had driven to my mother's house and sat at her kitchen table and told her things, and she had heard them, and now she was calling me to suggest a family meeting about whether the divorce was the right path forward. I asked her what Gregory had told her. She said she would rather not get into specifics over the phone. I said, "Mom, he was not faithful to me. For the last 3 years of our marriage he was not faithful, and I have documentation, and my lawyer has seen the documentation, and the documentation is why we are here." She said, "Renata, people have complicated situations and sometimes there are reasons." I ended the call. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after. Tobias was at school. The house was quiet in the way of a house that is in the process of becoming something different from what it has been. The 14 years of objects and arrangements and the specific accumulation of a life built with someone were still present, and I was sitting in the middle of them, understanding for the first time that I was going to have to build something from a place that had less support underneath it than I had understood. My uncle Raymond texted that week. 3 sentences. He had heard about the divorce and wanted me to know that he hoped Tobias would not be caught in the middle of things, and that family was the most important thing, and that he hoped I would remember that before making decisions that could not be undone. I read it twice. Tobias would not be caught in the middle. The man who had been physically present in my home 3 times in 16 years of Tobias's life was texting me about Tobias being caught in the middle. I did not respond. My Aunt Patricia, Raymond's wife, sent a card. A physical card in an envelope. Inside it she had written that she was praying for reconciliation and that she believed marriage was sacred, and that she knew I was going through a hard time, but that hard times were when the most important choices were made. She had signed it with love. I put the card in a drawer. My cousin Willa, who was 38 and had been the person I had called at midnight more than once across our ADLT lives when the calling needed to happen and the hour was wrong, went quiet. Not hostile. Just gone. The texts that had previously come regularly stopped coming. When I texted her, she replied with short answers that had the specific quality of someone managing a conversation they were uncertain about rather than having it. Claudette stopped returning calls entirely after the 2nd week. Gregory had worked quickly, and he had worked thoroughly, and the family that I had carried in my understanding as the people who would come had largely decided that the version of events he had provided was the version they were accepting. Harriet moved the case forward with the specific efficient precision of a lawyer who has good documentation and knows what to do with it. The divorce took 8 months. It was not clean. Gregory contested what he had reason to contest and accepted what he had no choice but to accept, and the final agreement was adequate in the specific way of things that are the best available outcome in the absence of a better one. Tobias lived with me. That was the part that mattered most. Tobias, 16 years old at the filing and 17 by the final agreement, lived with me in the house and saw Gregory on the schedule the agreement specified, and navigated the specific difficulty of being a child in the architecture of a divorce with the particular resilience of someone who had understood more about his father's character across 16 years than his father had understood. He understood. He did not say much about it. He cooked sometimes, which he had started doing the year before and which had become in the months of the divorce a way of being present in the house that did not require language. He would come home from school and go to the kitchen, and there would be something by the time I got home from work, not elaborate, just present. A pot of something. Bread from a loaf he had figured out how to make. The specific domestic intelligence of a 17-year-old who had decided that feeding people was the form of care that was available to him. I watched him cook and I understood that I was watching someone who was going to be fine. Not immediately. Not without cost. But fine in the specific eventual way of people who have decided to be fine before they have any particular evidence that fine is available. My mother called twice during the 8 months. Both times the calls had the quality of calls made to check whether the situation had changed rather than calls made to be present with me inside the situation as it was. I answered both of them. I told her the truth both times in clear and direct terms. She listened. She said things that communicated she was holding Gregory's version alongside mine and had not yet decided which one to put down. After the second call, I stopped expecting the third. The family that had been built around Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings and the specific accumulated warmth of people who had known each other across decades had reorganized itself around a version of events that left me at its edge. I understood this clearly by the 4th month. I was not at the center of the family anymore. I was adjacent to it in the way of someone who has been categorized as difficult and whose difficulty requires the rest of the system to maintain a certain distance. I was not difficult. I had married someone who was skilled at making his cruelties look like my problem. I was 41 years old with a son who cooked bread and a lawyer named Harriet and a house that was becoming something different from what it had been and a family that had made its choices. I made mine. I stopped reaching toward them. Not from anger. From the specific conservation of energy that becomes necessary when you understand the reaching is not landing anywhere useful. I focused on Tobias. On the work that paid for the house. On the slow and unglamorous process of building a life that was genuinely mine rather than the adjacent territory of a life that had belonged to someone else's narrative. Tobias started his last year of high school in September, and I watched him move through it with the focused attention of someone who had decided something about his future and was working toward it with the quiet determination of someone who does not announce what they are building until the building is done. He applied to culinary programs in November. He had been cooking for 2 years with the specific seriousness of someone for whom cooking was not a hobby but a direction. He had watched videos. He had read. He had practiced things repeatedly until they were right and then practiced them further until they were better than right. I had watched all of it from the kitchen doorway, and I had understood I was watching someone discover what they were for. He was accepted in March. Not to a local program. To one of 3 programs in the country that existed at the specific level he had been aiming at, the kind of program with a waiting list and an acceptance rate that produced silence when you said the number out loud. He told me at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening. He put the acceptance letter on the table between us and sat down across from me and looked at me, and I looked at the letter and the number of the acceptance rate and looked back at him, and neither of us spoke for a moment, and then he said, "I worked hard for this." I said, "I know." He said, "I want you to know that I know you did too." I looked at him across the table. He said, "The past 2 years. I know what they cost you and I know you did not let them cost me." I said, "Tobias." He said, "I know, Mom." He picked up the letter. He put it back in the envelope. He stood up and went back to the kitchen and started making dinner. I sat at the table for a long time. That was the Thursday. The calls started the following Tuesday. My mother called first. She had seen something. A friend of a friend who was connected to the culinary world had mentioned the program, the acceptance rate, the name attached to the acceptance. The name was my son's name. The name was also, through the mathematics of a divorce that was 14 months behind us, still a name that connected to the family that had reorganized itself around Gregory's version of events. She called at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday, and her voice had a quality I had not heard from her in over a year. Warm. Immediate. The warmth of someone arriving at a place they had been absent from and are presenting themselves as though the absence had been brief. "Renata. I heard about Tobias. Tell me everything." I sat at my desk at work with the phone against my ear and I looked at the wall in front of me. Tobias's acceptance letter was in a frame on the wall at home. Harriet had sent a congratulations card when I told her. My friend Dara, who had been present through the entire 2 years with the specific consistency of someone who had decided that presence was what she was offering and had offered it without interruption, had arrived at my door with flowers the evening after the Thursday dinner. My mother had not called on the Thursday. Or the Friday. Or the Saturday or Sunday or Monday. She was calling on Tuesday because the information had traveled through a network until it reached her, and the reaching of it had reminded her of a number she had not dialed in 14 months. He was accepted in March, I said. It is now May. A pause. I did not know. Nobody told me. No. Renata. He is my grandson. Yes. I would have wanted to know. I imagine so. The line was quiet for a moment. Then, I know things have been difficult between us, I said. Yes, she said. I want you to know that I never stopped loving you, I said. I know, she said. I hope we can find a way forward, I said. I am open to that, she said. I would love to see Tobias, I said. You can call him. He has the same number he has always had. I ended the call. My sister Claudette called that afternoon. Her voice had the specific quality of someone who has prepared what they are going to say and is delivering it with the warmth that preparation allows but genuine feeling does not always produce. She said she had heard the wonderful news and that she was so proud and that she had been thinking about me a lot lately and that she hoped we could reconnect. I let her finish. Then I said, you liked a photograph in November of 2022 that communicated you had accepted Gregory's version of what happened in our marriage, she said. Renata, I said, I am not rehashing it. I'm telling you that I remember what November of 2022 looked like and I noticed that it is May of 2024 and I am curious what changed. She said it was complicated. I said I knew. I said I was open to a conversation about rebuilding something but that rebuilding required starting from an honest account of what had happened, not from the convenient occasion of good news about my son. She said she understood. I said okay. We ended the call. My Uncle Raymond texted. 6 words. So proud of that young man. I read it. I put the phone down. I did not reply that day. The following morning I replied with 4 words. He worked for it. Raymond sent back a thumbs up. I left it there. My Aunt Patricia sent a card. Physical mail again, same handwriting, the practiced loops of someone who had written many cards across many decades. Inside she had written that she was overjoyed for the family and that she had always known Tobias was destined for great things and that she hoped this wonderful achievement would bring everyone back together. She signed it with love. I put the card in the same drawer as the first one. Willa texted on a Wednesday. A longer text than the brief managed ones of the previous 14 months. She wrote that she had heard and that she was so happy for Tobias and that she had been thinking about how much she had missed me and that she was sorry for the distance of the past year. She said she had not handled things well. She said she had not known whose version to believe and she had defaulted to distance rather than choosing. She said she understood if that was not good enough and that she would leave it with me. I sat with her text for a day before I responded. When I responded I said, I know you did not know whose version to believe. I know that was genuinely hard. But the way you find out whose version is accurate when you do not have enough information is you call the person you have known your whole life and you ask them directly. You did not call. For 14 months you did not call, and I needed people to call. She replied, I know. I am sorry. You are right. I said, I know you are sorry. I'm going to need time. She said, take whatever you need. I will be here. I put the phone down and looked at the wall and thought about 14 months. About the specific texture of navigating a divorce without the people I had understood to be my foundation and about what that navigation had required and cost and produced. About the mornings I had driven Tobias to school and come home to an empty house and sat in the kitchen with coffee and the specific weight of someone who is rebuilding from a foundation that turned out to have less under it than the surface suggested. About the evenings Tobias had cooked and the smell of the bread and the specific grace of a 17-year-old who had understood what the moment required of him and had given it without being asked. They had not called during any of that. They were calling now. Gregory called on a Thursday. I saw his name on the screen and I looked at it for the full duration of the ringing and let it go to voicemail. His message said he had heard about Tobias and that he was incredibly proud and that he hoped we could put things behind us for Tobias's sake now that there was something wonderful to celebrate. I deleted the voicemail without listening to it a second time. Tobias came home from his part-time job that evening and I told him about the calls. Not all of them. The shape of them. That people had been in touch since the news. He stood in the kitchen and listened and then he said, how do you feel about it? I said, clarified. He looked at me. I said, I am not angry. I am clear. He thought about that for a moment. Then he said, what are you going to do? I said, figure out what I actually want each of these relationships to look like going forward and build toward that rather than toward what they want the relationships to look like. He said, which is, I said, reconnected. On terms that are convenient for them now that the news is good. He nodded slowly. He said, and what do you want? I said, honesty. An actual account of what happened in the past 14 months. Not a step over it because there is something worth celebrating. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he turned back to the stove. He cooked. I sat at the table. The kitchen smelled the way it smelled when he was doing something careful. My mother came to the house in June. I had invited her after 2 more calls in which she had said things that were honest and that had cost her something to say, things about the weeks after the filing when she had sat with Gregory at her kitchen table and had received his version without calling me first, about the specific failure of that choice and what it had meant for the year that followed. She came on a Saturday morning and she sat at the kitchen table and Tobias made coffee and the 3 of us sat together. She looked at Tobias across the table for a long time. Then she said, "I'm sorry I was not here when it was hard." He looked at her. He said, "It was hard for a while," she said. "I know," he said, "Mom handled it." She looked at me. I looked back. She said, "I know she did." We talked for 3 hours. Not about Gregory. About the 14 months and what they had contained and what she understood now about what they had required and what she had not provided. She said things that were true and that she could not have said comfortably, and she said them anyway, and I received them as what they were, which was the beginning of something different from what had existed before, not a return to what had been but the start of something that had been earned through honesty rather than assumed through occasion. Claudette came in July. The conversation was harder. She was less willing to name specific things and more inclined toward the general language of difficult times and complicated situations, and I sat with that for a while before I said, "Claudette, you liked a photograph." She looked at me. "That is a specific thing. I need you to account for the specific thing," she said. "I did not think about what that communicated," I said. "I need you to think about it now." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I believed him," I said. "Why?" she said. "Because he was there first and he was convincing and I did not question it the way I should have." I said, "I know," she said. "I should have called you before I did anything else." I said, "Yes," she said. "I am sorry, Renata." I said, "I know," I said. "We can build something from this." "It is going to look different from before," she said. "Different how?" I said. "More honest. Less assumed. More of the kind of relationship where we actually talk about things rather than moving around them because moving around them is easier," she said. "I want that." I said, "Good. Then let us start from here." Willa and I had coffee in August. We sat across from each other in a place we had been going to for 15 years and we talked for 2 hours about the 14 months and what they had been and what she had not done and why and what she understood now that she had not understood then. She was more honest than I had expected, and the honesty produced something I had not been certain was going to be available, which was the beginning of the genuine warmth that had always been between us before it had been replaced by managed distance. At the end of the 2 hours she said, "I missed you." I said, "I missed you too," she said. "I did not handle it the way a real friend handles something." I said, "No," she said. "I'm going to handle it better." I said, "I know." I said, "I believe you." Tobias started his program in September. I drove him to the city where the program was and helped him carry things to the room and stood in the doorway for a moment before I left. He stood in the middle of the room with his hands in his pockets and he looked around at what was going to be his for the next 3 years, and his face had the specific expression of someone who has arrived at the place they were building toward and has found it to be real. He walked me to the car. He stood beside it for a moment. He said, "Thank you for the past 2 years," I said. "Tobias," he said, "I mean it. You did not let what was happening become what I was living in. I want you to know I understand that." I looked at him. 18 years old, standing on the sidewalk outside the building where his future was going to happen. I said, "You built this," he said. "We did." He hugged me. I held on. He stepped back and went back inside, and I got in the car and drove home. The house was quiet when I got back. Genuinely quiet in the way of a space that has changed its nature, not the absence of noise but the presence of a different kind of fullness. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table where Tobias had put his acceptance letter between us in March, and I looked at the room. The family had called when the news was good. Some of them were working their way towards something honest. My mother with her Saturday morning and her 3 hours of saying true things. Claudette with her specific accounting of the photograph. Willa with her 2 hours of coffee and the honesty that had produced something real. Some of them were not. Raymond's thumbs up. Patricia's card about things being brought back together. Gregory's deleted voicemail. I knew the difference. I had known it for 14 months. The good news had not changed the difference. It had simply produced a new test of the same question, and the answers were consistent with the answers that had been given before. The people who had come in the hard months were the people. Harriet with her documentation and her clarity. Dara at the door with flowers on the Thursday evening. The specific friends who had not reorganized themselves around Gregory's version and had called during the 14 months not because there was something to celebrate but because calling was the thing that was called for. I had rebuilt around them. Around Tobias. Around the work in the house and the slow accumulation of a life that was genuinely mine in every room and every choice and every morning that had started without someone else's narrative defining its shape. The family had remembered my number when the news broke. I had remembered exactly what they had done with my number when I had needed it most. Both things were true. Both things would continue to be true. What you do with both truths is what the next part of your life gets built from. I chose carefully. I built accordingly. The people who came in the dark are the people. Not the ones who arrive when the news is good and the celebration is easy and the association with the achievement is something worth having. The ones who drove in the dark. The ones who called when there was nothing to celebrate. Those are the ones worth building toward. Know who showed up when showing up costs something. Build your life around them. And when the others remember your number, answer carefully. Because you already know everything you need to know about who they are. You learned it when they forgot it.